Story 1: The Cornfield Encounter. This happened when I was young, so some details might be a bit fuzzy. But even now I still remember the important parts. I grew up in rural Nebraska, where farmlands stretched endlessly, as if they could go on forever. Every day I ride bike to school, because my parents were always busy with work. And it was just simpler that way. Far home sat on the edge of a massive cornfield, which looked even more enormous to a kid like me. To me it was a place that held a certain mystery, where the rows of corn towered high like walls. My parents were always clear about one rule: never cut through the cornfield. They were worried I'd get lost without a cell phone. I knew getting turned around in there could be dangerous, so I always stuck to the main road, even though it was a bit longer. I didn't have many friends nearby, so I didn't mind biking alone. It was actually peaceful in a way. Over time I developed a real love for biking, and I'd go on rides even during weekends. One day after school I was riding home as usual, when my bike chain suddenly popped loose. I tried everything I knew, but nothing worked. My dad had taught me how to fix my bike, but the chain just wouldn't go back on. The thought of walking the long way home with my bike sounded exhausting, and I didn't have a phone to call anyone for help. Just then I glanced at the cornfield, knowing cutting through would save me tons of time. I hesitated, remembering my parents' warnings, but it was still early and the sun was high, so I figured it couldn't be too hard to walk straight through it. I decided to give it a try. At first it was fine. The path between the rows was narrow but walkable, and the light filtering through the corn gave a warm, almost golden glow. But after a few minutes, things started to feel different. The stalks seemed to block out most of the light, and it was eerily quiet. I remember glancing back over my shoulder every few moments, feeling like something was just out of sight. I told myself it was just nerves, and kept walking, picking up the pace. After a while, I noticed a faint rustling, coming from somewhere within the corn, off to my left. At first I thought it was just the wind, but the noise felt too deliberate, too steady, like footsteps. I stopped to listen, but when the sound stopped too, I forced myself to keep going. Yet every few steps the rustling returned, slightly closer each time. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. I quickened my pace, gripping my bike's handlebars tightly. Then suddenly, I saw him. He was standing in the middle of the path right in front of me. He didn't look like anyone I'd expect to see there. His clothes were ragged, dirty, and there were long scratches on his arms. He stared at me with an unnerving stillness, and after a moment he asked in a low, raspy voice if I was lost. I froze, unable to speak or move. Then he took a step closer, extending his hand like he was going to reach for me. Panic surged through me, and somehow my legs started working again. I dropped my bike and ran as fast as I could, back the way I came. I heard him crashing through the corn behind me, calling out that he just wanted to help. I veered off the path, hiding between rows of corn, crouching down and holding my breath as he passed by, muttering to himself. I'll never forget those moments of sitting there, feeling like I was being hunted. After what felt like hours, I finally emerged from the cornfield and ran the rest of the way home. My parents were frantic with worry, and when I told them everything, They were both horrified. My dad went out to look for my bike, but it was gone. A few weeks later, something chilling happened that convinced us to move. One day after school, I came home to find my bike sitting on the porch, the same one I'd abandoned in the cornfield. None of us could explain it, and it was clear we weren't safe there anymore. Soon after we moved, even now, I can't shake the memory of that man in the cornfield, and the feeling of being watched. Story to the haunting at the family farm. Years later, after trying to make it as a writer, I returned to Nebraska to help my aging parents on our family farm. Things hadn't worked out as planned, and although it wasn't my dream, I wanted to be there for them. The farm was quiet, nestled in the middle of sprawling cornfields that seemed endless, almost isolated from the world. Our nearest neighbor, a widowed older woman, lived about a 10-minute walk away. Life slowed down in a way that I needed. During the day, I managed farm tasks, and at night, I'd write until I couldn't keep my eyes open. I stayed in the small attic room, where a single window overlooked the entire farm. It felt peaceful until I noticed something strange. Every evening around sunset, a figure would appear at the far edge of the cornfield. At first, I assumed it was someone from the neighbor's farm, maybe just checking their crops. They stood so still like a scarecrow. And for days, I couldn't even tell if they were looking my way. But as time went on, I noticed the figure seemed to be getting closer each night. One evening I watched it move slightly, and it sent a chill through me. I tried brushing it off, thinking it was harmless. But deep down something didn't feel right. I told my parents, but they were unconcerned. They figured it was the neighbor's son, who was known for being odd. Despite my concerns, they didn't see him as a threat. I decided to keep an eye on things. But few nights later, I was working late in the barn, when the power suddenly cut out, plunging the entire property into darkness. My heart raced as I fumbled for a flashlight. Then I heard the soft rustling of corn. I stepped outside and shone my light toward the cornfield. That's when I saw him. A man with a bald head and tattered overalls, standing just beyond the barn. He was holding a rusty garden tool, staring at me with a twisted look. I bolted toward the house, the man's footsteps thundering behind me. I barely made it inside, locking the door and calling the police. They searched the property, but found nothing, except a bucket of water dumped on the breaker box. My parents and I knew we couldn't stay there forever. With that stranger lurking around, we took added security measures. But after that night I was done. I left the farm and moved on. But that terrifying experience has stayed with me. To this day, I think back on that figure in the cornfield and wonder if he's still out there, watching and waiting. Story 3: The Forgotten Lake. This story takes place during a time when my friends and I were deeply fascinated by ghost stories and urban legends. We'd seek out local mysteries, hiking to supposedly haunted places in the area. It became our weekend ritual. And although most of our adventures didn't amount to much, we lived for the thrill of being scared. One weekend, we stumbled upon a story that seemed different. There was a lake hidden deep in the woods, about a 2-hour drive from our town. According to the story, people who visited at dusk would sometimes see a shadowy figure emerge from the water and disappear into the surrounding trees. The legend of the lake drew us in immediately. The tale went that a young woman had drowned there decades ago under mysterious circumstances, and since then her spirit was said to haunt the waters. Locals whispered about seeing her reflection in the lake, or hearing soft sobs echoing through the trees. Some claimed she'd lure people to the edge of the lake and into the water. We weren't exactly sure how much we believed it, but we were eager to test it out. We gathered our flashlights, snacks, and headed out one chilly October evening, determined to see if the stories held any truth. The journey to the lake felt longer than we expected, the forest around us growing denser as we walked. It was hard to shake. The feeling that the trees were closing in, almost as if they were leading us somewhere. By the time we reached the lake, dusk was settling, casting an eerie glow over everything. The lake was smaller than I'd imagined, with dark water that looked unnervingly still. There was a silence around it, a kind that made you want to hold your breath. Even the usual sounds of the forest were missing. The atmosphere was unsettling, but none of us wanted to admit it out loud. We set up a small camp near the edge, turning off our flashlights to let our eyes adjust to the dimming light. The silence weighed on us, each of us staring out at the lake, waiting for something, though none of us knew what. After a few minutes, someone suggested we call out to the spirit. It seemed silly, almost childish, but we all agreed, one by one. We softly called her name, Lily, into the darkness, feeling a strange sense of expectation each time. We'd laugh after each call, convincing ourselves it was just a story. But there was an undercurrent of fear we couldn't ignore. The first strange thing happened when one of my friends, David, noticed a faint ripple in the water, like something had just broken the surface. We all hushed, straining our eyes toward the lake. The ripple faded quickly, leaving the water as still as before. But then faintly, I heard what sounded like someone crying. A soft, muffled sound that seemed to come from somewhere near the lake's center. My heart raced, and I looked around at my friends. Their faces mirrored my own shock, and I knew they heard it too. As the crying grew louder, it felt like it was moving closer, though there was no sign of anyone. The sound was almost too quiet to pinpoint, yet so distinct that it seemed to echo in my head. Suddenly the water began to ripple again, this time more violently. We watched in stunned silences. A dark, shadowy figure slowly emerged from the lake, its outline barely visible against the darkening sky. It looked like a woman, her long hair clinging to her face, obscuring her features. She didn't seem to walk or swim, just move, gliding across the surface, as if gravity had no hold on her. I wanted to run, every instinct telling me to get out of there. But I couldn't move. None of us could. The figure drifted toward the shore, the crying sound growing softer, but somehow sharper, more desperate. Her face remained hidden, her movements almost mesmerizing. As she reached the edge of the water, she stopped and raised her head slightly, though we couldn't see her eyes. That's when one of my friends whispered, "Run." The voice snapped us out of our trance, and we turned and bolted back into the forest, tripping over roots and each other in our haste. The darkness of the woods swallowed us as we ran, barf, flashlights bouncing in all directions, illuminating only brief glimpses of the trees around us. The air felt colder, and it was like the sounds of the forest had returned, amplified and distorted, as if mocking our escape. We didn't look back, but I could feel something close behind, like a heavy presence pressing us onward. It felt like hours, but eventually we broke free of the woods, gasping and out of breath. Only then did we stop and look back, half expecting to see her, standing at the edge of the trees, watching us. We never saw the figure again, but each of us heard that cry echoing in our heads. For days, it was like she had imprinted herself into our memories. David later told us he'd had dreams of her face, her pale haunting eyes staring back at him, almost like she was waiting for something. And it wasn't just him. Each of us felt marked in some way, as if leaving the lake hadn't been enough to escape her. The experience haunted us, driving a wedge into our friendship. We couldn't talk about that night without feeling her presence all over again. Eventually we drifted apart, unable to face the memory or each other. Now every October I think about going back to the lake, just to see if she's still there waiting. But something holds me back. Deep down, I know it's better to leave some stories alone. Some things once seen can never be forgotten.